Hey guys, sorry for the change in location. I'm going to give everyone a couple more minutes because I know a couple people were traveling back from the Tech Garden. If you are watching on YouTube and have not joined the Zoom room and are, of course, a student, please check the Slack and join the Zoom meeting. I'm going to give everyone a couple minutes before we dive in.
Hi, Max.
Hello.
Oops. Okay, there I am.
I just posted the VS Code link in Slack. If anyone is having trouble accessing that and pulling up the code, please let me know.
I don't know if Karen told you, but she's going to be a little late because she's going home first.
I got that message. Thank you. Can you guys see that code on your screen, or is that too tiny for you guys? I have a huge monitor, so I want to make sure that you can see it.
It's tiny on my screen.
Okay. Or maybe one step bigger.
Okay.
That up and that up. Okay, so something's flashing. Perfect. Thank you, Caitlin. Okay, so I think we're going to get started here. Just because we're remote doesn't mean that you guys shouldn't participate. So definitely keep your fingers on your unmute button. We're going to be trying to be as engaged as possible. I also shared this VS Code link not as read only. So hopefully I'm going to try and incorporate a little bit more collaboration into this. We will see where that goes. But to get started, what's the first step? We're at the beginning of a new workday, essentially. Where do we dive in?
The JavaScript on the front end to display and post new items from the server?
Yeah, so that's the correct answer, but the answer I was actually looking for is, well, the first thing we should do is open up our list, right? We should open up what whatever our project management software was. In this case, it just so happens to be that we were using Google Docs. So I'm going to blow this up, and we're going to look at this and we go, right, that's where we were at. We got the form set up yesterday. We got the backend connected to it. We stored some information in our database. We got information back. So we're going to look at that. Okay, we're making progress here. So let's get our code fired up to get started, right? So I'm going to go to my VS Code, and I need to get my server started. But before I can start my node server, I want to make sure my Postgres server is also running. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Docker, and I'm going to make sure that Docker is running in the background. And then I'm going to go to Gus's folder where I have my Docker script. I'm going to wait 1 second for Docker to finish booting. And that's taking its sweet time. I'm waiting for it to stop moving up in my desktop. There we go. Now Docker is started. So I am going to start my server by running Postgres start. And by the way, I did talk to the instructors about doing a class specifically on Docker. And Alice is going to come in next Wednesday and give us a basic 30-minute rundown on Docker, the terms of Docker, why we use Docker, what the basic layout is, and just do a 30-minute info session on that. So that is coming next Wednesday. But for now, we have our Postgres server started. So I am going to CD back into my folder, into my to-do app, and I am going to nodemon enter, and my server should in theory be running now. So I'm going to go to Chrome. I'm going to open up a new tab, and I'm going to go to my localhost 8080, and I go, okay, great. We have our interface back up. I'm going to blow this up as well, and I'm going to look in my console. And I'm going to blow up my console, and we got this error. And the reason we got the error is because it's trying to access 127.0.0.1, and it's getting blocked because of ports. So I need to change my URL up here. I need to change that back to 127.0.0.1 so it matches the API server that I'm trying to hit. And now I get my lovely tasks back. So I'm going to pop open that code. I'm going to look at the objects, and I'm going to see that this information is coming back from the database. So instead of just diving back into our front end and getting this information to show up in the front end, I want to make sure I remember where that's coming from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to my server code. I'm going to look at my index.js, which is running my server, and I'm going to look at my app.get task. Well, why am I going to look there? Because in my front end, we are doing a get call to /task and then console logging out that data. So I'm going to go back to my server index.js. I'm going to look at my app.get. I'm saying, okay, I'm going to the database using my models, pulling out all the to-dos, and then sending them back. Okay, great. There's one more place that I want to look. I'm going to go to my P-SQL application. I'm going to connect in here, and I'm going to go to my to-dos and look at my content. Of course, I'm not able to blow this up for you guys, so I do apologize for that. Let's see if I can change. No, I cannot change any of the settings in here. I apologize if that's probably so tiny on your guys' screen. We see that there are some tasks in the database, and if we go look in our front end, we see that those two tasks are also coming out and we have access to them. Great. What do we do now?
Are you going to your HTML and starting Bootstrap?
Yeah, so we actually already have our Bootstrap set up, right? The interface wouldn't look quite as nice as it does already, unless we had our Bootstrap set up. But what we do have already set up is this dummy data, right? So basically what we want to do is use this dummy data and replace the dummy data with what's actually already in the database for us. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to go to our index.html. And where else did we where else did we update our front end? Well, where else we did that was our chat room app, right? We already built a front end. So there's nothing saying we can't reuse the code that we already coded out. Fortunately, that is in Glitch. So I'm going to head over to Glitch. I'm going to pop open that workspace. And we're going to look at our glitch code. So in our glitch code, in the front end, we did this lovely receive, right? And we have the content to update and the and we looped over the messages to display them. So I'm going to put this code off to the side and shrink this down and put this over here. And we're going to use that code to get our interface showing the tasks that we have in the database. So instead of just console logging out our data, we know our data is an array. So what we want to do is basically say, hey, go loop over each task that you're getting in the database. And for each thing that you loop over, let's build out the HTML. Let's get that HTML that we're going to then use JSON to dump into the front end. So let's take a quick look at what was console logging out. And what was console logging out was an object called tasks that was an array that had all the data in it. So what we're going to do is we're going to say for const task of data.tasks. And because we're getting the task data back from our server endpoint and parsing out the JSON into an actual object that we can use, we should be able to access that. So before we go too far, let's confirm that our loop is working and running the number of times we want it to. So I'm just going to console log task out. I'm going to go back to my front end. I'm going to refresh, and we see that it did indeed console log out 2 times. Okay, so we know we're making progress. So now let's start building out our HTML. So I'm going to go up to the HTML we already have built. I'm going to copy it. And then outside our for loop, I'm going to create a new variable called content to update. And I'm going to make it an empty string. And the reason why we want that outside of our loop is if we put it inside the loop, every time we iterated through a new task, we're going to reset the content to update. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we continue to add to it. So what we're going to do is we are going to say content to update plus equals, right? So every time this runs, append something onto it. And we're going to use backticks. And the reason we want to use backticks is because we want to inject some other variable data into this string that we're about to generate. And I'm going to paste in the whole block of HTML code. And so now we can look at our task and go, okay, well, the first thing we want the name of the task in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight this code in here and do a $ curly braces. And that's going to mean that when the code goes to run, JavaScript's going to pause and go, oh, you don't actually want to type that exact word in there. What you want to type in is the value of whatever variable we're about to put in there. So what we're going to do is we are going to put in task.name. And then for the next column, I'm just going to pop this open, we're going to use the username. So I'm going to replace this with task.username. Okay. Now we have, I forget what this one is, right? So I'm just going to scroll up, I'm going to look, and I'm going to go, oh, that's the due date, okay? So I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to say task.due date. But in the database, it's actually called due time. So we want to make sure that we're using the variable names that are getting passed back to us into JSON. The next thing is completion time. So we can do that as well. Task dot, I'm going to look again over here, and it is called completion time. So we're going to use that. Okay, and our edit buttons, we're going to leave alone for now. That's going to require some work to get those to be functional, because we need to trigger more API calls based off of that. But for now, let's just see what happens here. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm going to go back here. By the way, you guys can access what I'm running here by going over to live share. And you should have a section called shared servers. And you should be able to click on this localhost 8080 and have access to the code. I am realizing, however, that you guys are going to have CORS errors because Visual Studio Code requires me to do localhost. So if you guys click on this, it should open the tab. And then down in your console, you'll probably get a CORS error here. So I'm going to try and fix that by, instead of using 127, I'm going to try and use localhost, and let's see if this fixes it. Okay, that did fix it. So you guys should be able to open your console and see the two tasks in here. If you can't, please comment in on Zoom or send me a Slack message. I also have that up as well. Linda, in answer to your question, I am sharing it already. So if you do not see shared servers over on the left-hand side where my mouse is, please let me know. Okay. Can anyone in the Zoom room confirm that they are able to open up localhost 8080 and see something similar to the, be able to access my server? Okay, Kelly has it. Linda, I'm not quite sure why you're not able to access that. It might be on a little bit of a delay. If you still can't access it, what I would recommend is closing out the Visual Studio Code completely and then opening it back up. Awesome, thanks. If it sounds like I'm talking to myself, by the way, I have Slack open on my other monitor, so I'm seeing what people are typing and I'm answering those questions. So I promise I'm not going crazy yet. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to save, I'm going to refresh, and nothing changed. Okay, well, why is that? I go in my console and it's still, it has the objects in here. That's all good. Does anyone know what step we missed?
Do we have to do the document.body thing?
Something similar, yeah. So basically what we did is we built out all of our HTML here. And if I come down outside of my loop and console log out my content to update and refresh it, we actually do have our HTML getting built here. What we aren't doing is telling jQuery, hey, go take this HTML and stick it into the table. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up here, and in our table body, we are going to set an ID on that called table body. so we can access it in our JavaScript code. We're going to come down here and we're going to use jQuery to say table body dot HTML. So, hey, we want to replace whatever is in the table body with our content to update. And I'm going to refresh. Not quite what we wanted, but hey, we have working code. That's working. And we see some information coming out. So I'm actually going to go to pSQL and I'm going to edit the name of the task and I'm going to call one task one and hit save, hopefully. Or not. That I was hoping that was going to work for us. Apparently, pSQL does not want to save that data. Okay. What I'm going to do instead is write out a little raw SQL. So I'm going to say update to-dos where ID equals 1, right? Because that's our ID. And I'm going to say set name equal to to-do 1. I'm going to run that query. Syntax error. Did I do that in reverse order? Believe maybe we have to do our where at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and run that query, and it says the relations to to-dos does not exist. Okay, that's interesting. I'm not able to execute my raw query either. Is it not called? No, it's called name, and we're using ID. Maybe try single quotes, see if that makes it happier. Okay. I'm wondering if we're having an issue because our table name is a capital T, and normally table names are lowercase t or lowercase letters. So I'm going to investigate that hypothesis a little bit. I'm going to change my table name here to a lowercase t, and then I'm going to turn on my force sync, which is going to tell SQLize, hey, drop what is in the database, wipe it out, and we'll start over fresh. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to refresh. We do have our to-dos in here as now. So I'm just going to go refresh the page, and we're going to create new to-dos. So I'm going to say to-do, I'm going to say name max, task is to-do 1, due date is tomorrow. I will submit that. Notice it didn't show up here yet. So now we need to start keeping a list of, all right, well, that should have showed up there, but we'll worry about that in a second. So I'm going to refresh, and my to-do 1 did show up. Okay, so I'm going to do my name as Max again. I'm going to do to-do 2. I'll set that to-do date for the 28th. I'm going to submit it. Again, nothing happened, but if I refresh, I see that that's in there. Okay. So we want to do one problem at a time, right? So the first thing I want to do is resolve this creator issue. For whatever reason, my name is not showing up there, even though we typed it in here. So the first place I'm going to check is I'm going to go to the database, and I'm going to look at the content. And the reason for that is I need to know there are a lot of places this could go wrong, right? The submit call, the save call, the post request to the API endpoint may not have sent the username data up, or it might not have gotten the value properly from the HTML using jQuery, or the server could have gotten it and not stored it in the database properly, or when we got the data out of the database, it may not have saved it properly, or when the information came back to the front end and we went to update it in the front end, maybe the data wasn't there. So I need to trace through all of those steps and figure out where it went wrong. Well, super tiny on your guy's screen, you can see that the username Max is set here. So that means that whenever the task was created, it did make its first trip from the front end form submission into the database to save it there. So we know the issue isn't a problem with saving tasks into the database. Or if you think about the CRUD, the create code is working. What isn't working is our read code. So let's go back into our index.html, and I'm going to look here, and I'm console logging out my task. So before we get to the HTML step, let's look at what console logged out. Okay, well, what console logged out was all the data, and I see Max here. Does anyone see the problem?
The username has the N capital.
That's exactly it. So I'm going to capitalize the N in username. I am going to refresh, and we see creator now. Awesome. Making progress. So my next issue is due date has the date set, but it looks hideous. How do we solve that?
Reformat the date.
We format the date. Do you remember what library we used to format the date?
Did we use moment?
We used moment. So again, I'm going to go back to our chat room code, and I am going to find where we import moment. And we can't just use moment, right? We have to tell our browser, go download that. So I'm going to put that in that script tag, and we are now importing moment from a CDN, and now we can use moment. Well, I don't remember the document, don't remember the method right off the top of my head, but fortunately, because we already used it, I can scroll over here and I have this lovely moment message timestamp format. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to put it right in here, and instead of doing message.timestamp, oops, copied a little bit too much there. Instead of doing message.timestamp, I am going to do task dot, go look, I'm going to do task dot due time. I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'll refresh in here, and we get a CORS error. So I'm going to change this back to localhost, and that's because I made the change on my code. And what do we get? We get the same exact thing. Okay, let's figure out why that is. I'm going to save again.
Max, is there a best practice for managing all of these names for things? You know, like username and name and whether you capitalized or not, so you can avoid those mistakes?
So in JavaScript, the standard is camel case. So anything that would have a space in it would become a capital letter. The thing where it gets hairy is you go, well, is username one word or two?
Right.
And the way I would answer that is actually go to the dictionary and do a search for username. And username does appear to be one word. So my answer to that is username should be a lowercase n instead of a capital one.
Yeah, but I mean, just managing all of these different names. Like, is there, like, I guess you could just set up a separate file just to keep track of them.
Yeah. The best practice is to make them match on the front end and the back end.
Right.
So instead of it being, when we send the data up to the server, we call it due date. But when it comes back from the server, it's due time. Well, that's not really best practice. So what I would do is I would get all the code working first, and then I would go back and start reformatting it. and refactoring it and going, okay, well, let's change it. Do we like due time better, or do we like due date better? Well, you know what? It's not really the time that it's due. It is actually the date. So we should probably change everything to say due date. With that said, there is not a list of, here are the 100 things that you should call your columns in your database. It is not standardized to that level.
Yeah, no, I don't mean that. I mean, but once you've decided what to call it, I mean, you could probably just have another folder with everything commented out, but where you keep a log or an index of what you've called things, right?
Yeah, you definitely can. And the easiest place to go is your models for that. If you wanted a pure list of what you call things, yep, you could definitely do that, or start some documentation somewhere. But your models tend to be the de facto name, the de facto place of where you define what your field names are.
Okay. Got it.
Okay, so I'm going to go back here and I'm going to look at this and I'm going, wait, my due date still is not the right time, right? That looks ugly. Why is that? Wait a second, my completion time is 12 a.m. That's not right. I didn't complete these tasks yet. So I'm going to go back to my code and I'm going to realize, wait a second, I didn't change my due time. I am in the wrong column. So I'm going to change this back to our task.completion time. And I'm going to actually change our time in the right field. So now that I'm in the right column, I'm going to refresh and I get my due date, but my due date is 12 a.m. Well, we don't want our due time to show up. We really only want the date to show up. And the reason why the time's showing up is because we passed it this LT as the parameter. We don't really want it passing the time. So I'm going to go on the Moment.js website and I will blow this up and we're going to look and we're going to say, all right, what format do we want our date to show up in as? I personally like this June 26, 19. So I'm going to copy that format. I'm going to put that in here and I'm going to drop the year off of it because, I don't really care what the year is. I just want the date. If you wanted the year in there, you're welcome to keep the YY. So I'm going to find my code and refresh it. And we now have June 27th and June 28th, which is perfect. I'm actually going to drop the O off of that. And I believe that's going to drop the TH off it as well. So I'm going, all right, great. And if you remember, when I created these two tasks, I did pick those dates in the date picker. So we're doing well. Now we run into completion time. Well, if the task is not completed, I don't want null to show up, right? You never really want an end user to see null. The reason why it's null is because in the database, there's no data in there. So it's coming back as null. Does anyone have any ideas of how we can just make this blank if the data is null?
Max, can you make it an empty string?
I sure can, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So in task.completion time, we're going to do what's called a ternary operator. And a ternary operator is basically an inline if statement. So what we're going to do is we're going to say task time ? And basically what that's saying is if there is a in your task time, go ahead and show the completion time. Otherwise, make it an empty string. And so when I refresh that, our completion time is now gone. But if I come up here and I just fake some data and I say task.completion time new date, we're going to see, well, there's some completion time in there. But you know what? We also want that data to show up as the same thing as the due date, except now maybe we do want it to show up the time. So while I'm in here, I'm going to say moment and I'm going to pass in the completion time, and then I'm going to do my dot format, and I'm going to go back to the moment documentation. And you know what? Let's get fancy. Instead of showing the time it was completed, let's use moment to show how long ago it was completed, because I think that's pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is, instead of using format that's built into the moment library, I'm going to use this from now function. So I'm going to change this, instead of format, I'm going to say from now. And I'm going to save, and I'm going to go back, and I have a gazillion tabs open here. So I'm just going to clean up a little bit. So I only have one. I'm going to refresh, and what do we get a few seconds ago? Now, again, that's only because I put in new date. I kind of faked it, and I said, hey, ignore what's in the database. I'm telling you the completion time is right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete that out, and we want to make sure that it still shows up as blank when the value is null. So I'm going to refresh, and our completion time is still null. Awesome. Before we continue, let's go back to our brainstorm list. And let's see, support for timestamps created, completed, and due. Okay, well, we're not quite there, but what we do have done is the created timestamp working. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cross that off. We don't have the ability to edit or mark it completed yet, but we do have the JavaScript front end to display the items from the server. And we can, well, we're displaying it. So we're going to cross that off. We're going to celebrate the fact that that is done. And then we need to do one more thing to completely cross that off. We ran into a bug when we were trying to fix our table, right? So when we go here and I create a task with my name and I say to do 3, and I set my due date as the 30th, I hit submit. Well, the fetch worked and our console updated. And if I go to my database and refresh that table, it saved it into the database. But what did it not do? It didn't add it here. So what we want to do is we want to go to our post code, and instead of just console logging out fetch worked, we want it to go through and update all the tasks. So what I'm going to do is, instead of copying and pasting this code, that isn't being dry, right? That's breaking the fundamental principle of don't repeat yourself. So what we're going to do is we're going to abstract this code out to a function that can be used both in the new task creation and also when we first load the page. So I'm going to take this code, I'm going to cut it, and down here I'm going to do a new function called update tasks in HTML. And that is going to take a parameter of data. And then I'm going to open that up and I'm going to paste all of my code in. Now, if I save this and refresh, all of a sudden I have my dummy data back in here again. 139, and I have another error somewhere. Oh, it's trying to console log out a variable that doesn't exist. So I'm going to clear that out. Okay, so I have my dummy data again. Well, we created this function, but now we need to use the function. Now we need to tell it, hey, when you get the tasks, go ahead and call update tasks in HTML and send in that data. So if I refresh, now our to-dos are back, and you notice that one I created before is in here. So if I create a new one, flip these, and set my to-do date and submit, it's still not working. because we need to repeat this step again. We need to take what we called in our get and also do it in our post when we send the data to the task endpoint. So I'm going to console log our data here, and I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to put in my name, I'm going to put in my task, I'm going to set a due date, I'm going to hit submit, and we get an error. Okay, data.tasks is not iterable. So we go, all right, well, let's look. We have our data, we're looping over it, but you know what? We know this code is working because when we refresh the page, the data from the database is in here. What's wrong?
Is it because it's sending back JSON and we have to stringify, or?
So you're close. It's sending back JSON. So let's look at that code. It's sending back JSON. We are actually running out the raw JSON.json. So we are getting the data. But let's look. We were smart. We thought ahead here and we put in our console log. So let's look at what's happening. Index 127 matches my line 127 right here. So what's coming out? Message OK. Well, we can't loop over message OK because what update tasks in HTML is expecting is all the tasks to iterate over. So if we go to our server-side JS and look at our post task, we're creating the task in the database. And once it's done, we just send back message OK. So what's happening is the database is creating the task, but it's not sending back all the other tasks that are there with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this, and we are going to say tasks. And what is tasks going to be equal to? It's going to be equal to our await models.todo.findAll. So we're modifying our post endpoint here to say, okay, well, after you created the task, go ahead and send back all the other tasks in the database, all the other to-dos in the database. So we're going to save that. We're going to notice our server reboots down here. I'm going to refresh. I'm going to refresh, and we done broke something. I was not expecting that to happen, but okay, let's figure out what happened there. So log out our task. So it looks like something is happening really quick and then is clearing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out this code. I'm going to refresh it again, and that still is not breaking it. So I'm going to comment out this code, and I'm going to refresh. And what that did is it left our dummy data in, but it did not update it, right? Because we told it don't update tasks in HTML. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to console log out my data to see what information is coming back when we use that endpoint. Oh, you know what I did? I left my force true on. So as soon as the database rebooted, it wiped out our database with all of our data that we already put in it. So that is a good reminder to make sure your force true is only turned on when you want to reset your database models. So I'm going to go back here. So the issue wasn't with our front end code at all. I'm going to take out that console log. I'm going to turn this back on, and I'm going to refresh. And there are no tasks in our database. So again, we just found a issue. We don't actually want a blank table to show up when there are no tasks in the database. It would be nice if it said no tasks or create task above to get started. But let's focus on the issue we were trying to solve, right? The issue we were trying to solve is that when we click on the submit button, we want to make sure that the task shows up in the table. So I'm going to type in my name. I'm going to say task 1. I'm going to set a due date tomorrow. I hit submit, and lovely. Our task shows up in the database. But what it does not do is clear out our form fields, right? And we probably want it so when we create a new task, it does clear those out. So I'm going to go back to my code, and in my fetch request, right after I pull the values out, I also want to reset those values. So I'm going to do jQuery again and go grab my name and set the value equal to an empty string. And then go get my task and set the value again to an empty string. And then go grab my due date and set that to an empty string as well. And so I'm going to refresh. I'm going to do task 2. I'm going to put in my to-do date. I'm going to hit submit. Now our form is cleared out. It's showing up in the table, and we should be good to go. I'm going to take a second here. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to ask in Slack or in Zoom. Okay. I don't see anyone typing in Slack, so I'm going to keep going. So what do we do next? Well, let's go back to our to-do list. We have it displaying on the front end. We are able to post new items from the server. So we are going to cross that off, and we're going to take a minute and celebrate the fact that we are making progress. Yay. Okay, so looking at this list, we're doing pretty well. There are only 2 things really left to do here, right? We have to support edit. We have to be able to mark it completed. And we just have to support the timestamp for completed as well, which, you know what? I think we're kind of already doing that, right? If we look at our code, we did handle the moment for the completion time, and we definitely handled moment for due time as well. So I'm crossing that off the list too. Yeah, making progress. So the only thing left that we have to do is the ability to edit it, mark it completed, and I am going to add one more thing on here. We do also have to support delete, because we have the button for it. We need to make the button work. Anyone have any preferences on where we start? All right. In that case, I'm starting with editing. I'm going to start with marking it completed, right? Because that just makes sense. So what I'm going to do is, instead of this being empty, what I'm going to do is change the column in the interface. Instead of it saying completion time, I'm going to change it to say just completion. And instead of it showing up as an empty string in here, what I want it to do is, I want it to show the time if it is indeed completed. But if it's not completed, I want to put a button in there that will let you mark it as completed. So in here, I'm going to create a new button, and I'm just going to format this code a little bit just so we can see it. And when we open the button, we have to make sure we close the button. And in here, we are going to say mark as completed. And I'm going to save. I'm going to refresh, and we get this hideous button. Well, that's fine, but we're using Bootstrap, so we might as well make it pretty. So we are going to say class equals btn. And you notice my colors have gone berserk in here. And the reason why my colors have gone berserk is because I open the string right here, and then I close it, and then I type btn and I open the string again. We don't want to open the string and close the string. We just want it to continue on. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a backslash in here to basically say, hey, ignore these two quotes. I'm not actually trying to close the string. I just want to leave that quote mark in there. Another way of getting around that would be to use single quotes instead of double quotes, or to use template literals, which is getting a little complicated. So we'll just leave it as single quotes. I'm going to say btn, and then I'm going to say btn.success. I happen to know that one off the top of my head, but anything btn success is going to make the button green. So I'm going to refresh it, and I get my mark as completed. So I'm going to click on mark as completed, and everything's going to just work, and it's going to show the date, right? No, not exactly. We have to do all the full SAP stuff as well. So I click mark as completed, nothing happens. Okay, so now let's make something happen. What we want to happen is we want the completion date to show up in the database for that specific task. But then what we also want to do is have the date show up in the front end as well, because we actually completed it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a onClick function. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, when we click on something, okay, now I lied. I'm going to change these to a template literal, and we'll see why in a second. And when I say template literal, I mean backticks. And then I'm going to change these back to quotes. You'll see why in a second. So what I want to do is when I click on something, I want to call a new function called mark as completed. But I not only want to call a new function called mark as completed, in that function, I'm going to need to know what task you're clicking on. So fortunately, when we look at what data is coming back from the database, it already created an ID for us that is unique to that task. Well, how did it do that? Because that's pretty convenient. Well, if we look at our models, we already did the work on our to-do to add in an ID, and we told SQLize, hey, go get Postgres to auto-increment it and make it a primary key for us. So we are going to take advantage of that and use that through the whole process. So in our mark as completed, instead of just calling mark as completed, I'm also going to pass mark as completed the task.id. And I'm using this template literal here because I'm saying actually dump in whatever the value of task.id is, which in our case is 1 and 2. Okay, so now I need to tell my JavaScript, hey, what is mark as completed? So I'm going to do a new function, mark as completed, and mark as completed is going to take an ID as the parameter. And now I'm going to do another fetch to the server. So I am going to copy my post code. Oops. Well, this is much more sensitive than it normally is. There we go. That actually only goes to here. Okay. So I'm going to put in my post code here. And instead of post, I'm actually going to do a put. And the reason I'm going to do a put is because we're editing data that already exists. So what do I want to put? Well, I want to put the ID of the ID that we passed in here. So I'm going to say, all right, go ahead and send the ID up to the server. And then we'll worry about the data in a second, right? So great, now we did a put to the server. Now we need to go update our server and make that put thing happen. So I'm going to say app.put /task async rec res. And the reason why we're doing async is because we don't want to tell the front end we've actually updated that to do until we actually have updated it in the database. So what we're going to say is we are going to say const to do equals await. Hey, I want you to find this in the database. I don't want any other JavaScript code to run until that data comes back from the database. And we're going to say models.todo.find by ID. And you know what? I think they just renamed that function. I believe it's actually find by PK for primary key. Let's find out if I'm right. So it says, okay, well, what primary key do you want to find your to-do from? And I'm going to say rec.body.id. Well, where's that ID coming from? That ID is coming from the ID that we're passing it right here. I'm going to save that. I'm going to put that here. Before I forget, I am going to res.send, and eventually we'll figure out what we want to send back. But I want to console.log my to-do. I want to know if the database actually was able to find my to-do. So I'm going to refresh my page here. I'm going to mark this as completed. And we get some error here. We'll worry about that in a second. The reason we're getting that error is because we're not sending anything back to the server. I'm sorry, back to the front end from the server. But I'm going to open up my terminal and look at this lovely thing we got, our to-do logged out with all of our data as well. So we just found it in the database. Now we need to update it. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down here and we're going to say completion time is equal to a new date. It is equal to right now. Okay. But before we go back and we tell the server, hey, that's now updated, what we also need to do is say, hey, we updated that, go save that in the database. And we don't want to tell the front end that we have updated the time until we have definitely made sure that the database has been updated. So we're going to say await saving that into the database as well. Okay, now that we are there, what do we want to send back to the server? Well, let's be safe. Let's go ahead and send back all the tasks to the server. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm going to refresh my front end. I'm going to click on mark as completed. And that worked. Although we have completion a few seconds ago, and if we wait a couple seconds and refresh that page, well, it's still a few seconds ago. Let's give it a second. But you notice what happened. Now task 2 is up on the top. So the reasoning for that is the server is sending back our tasks, but because task 1 was updated more recently, it's going to send that back last. So that may be functionality we want. We may want all the uncompleted tasks to be up at the top and all the completed tasks to be at the bottom. But to really enforce that, we're going to do a sort. So what we're going to do is in our find all, we are going to do a new object, and we're going to say sort by, and we're going to do a double array. And we'll see why in a second. And what we want to do is we want to say, hey, sort by our completion time and make all of those ascending. And so if I refresh, nothing changes. But if I do descending, DESC, and refresh, it still doesn't work. Don't you love it when your code doesn't do what you want it to? Let's see, maybe it is just sort. Descending, ascending. Okay, so let's go to our front end. I'm doing that on the get task. That's what I want it to do. So in our for loop, in our new task, mark as completed. Where is our update task in HTML? I want to console log out our data here to see what order it's coming back in. So I'm going to refresh. Our tasks come back with 2 and then 1. And then if I go back to our code and change this to DESC and refresh, we see that it's still 2 and 1. So now we know the issue is that our sort isn't working. So I'm going to go to the SQLize documentation. And I want to look up querying. And I'm going to do a search for sort. And sort isn't here. Of course it isn't. Okay, I'm going to go back to Google. I'm going to go to SQLize. I'm going to do a sort. Oh, you know what it is? It's not sort, it's order. I was close. Okay, let's save. Let's go back here. Let's refresh. We still have 2 and 1, but if we change this to ascending, now they flipped. So I think it makes sense personally that we put the completed task down at the bottom. So I am going to change this to descending. And now if I create task 3 with a due date of whatever. Now, when we look at that, that came down at the bottom. Well, we don't want that to be at the bottom. We want the uncompleted task to always be at the top. So if we look, that when we send back all the to-dos, in the get is the only place we told it that it should order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that order code and I'm going to say, hey, it doesn't matter if you get a task. It doesn't matter if you're putting a new task up there or if you are marking it as completed. It doesn't matter. We always want it to be the completed task at the bottom. So I'm going to create a task 4. I'm going to set my due date. I am going to submit it. And now it's there. And if I mark task 3 as completed, it jumps down to the bottom. Now you also notice that our task is now saying 4 minutes ago. So the data is now properly saving into the database, and we can see that as well. So making progress. We have 2 things left to do. So let's go back to our brainstorm list. We have the ability to mark it completed. So before going forward, we're going to take a minute, we're going to celebrate, and we're going to cross something off the list. Yay! Okay. We have to edit and we have to delete. So it doesn't really matter, edits first on the list. So let's get that working because you know what? It's going to be pretty close to our completion time. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at our edit button, and we're going to do something very similar with our edit button than we did with our mark is completed. So we are going to say on click, edit to do, and we need to pass it that task ID as well, because the server needs to know what task do you want to edit. So let's go ahead and make our function. Our function is called edit to do. It takes an ID. It's going to make a fetch request, and it's still going to be a put. But instead of just making it to task, we are going to say task/edit name. And we're going to do our put. We're still going to put the ID. But when we put the ID, we also need to say what the new name is going to be. So what we're going to do is we are going to add some additional information. And what do we want to pass up? We want to pass it a name. Well, what name? Well, let's tell our front-end JavaScript to prompt the user for what the name should be. And we should probably tell them what we're prompting it for. So we're going to say window.prompt, what would you like this task to be called? And we're going to save. And now let's assume that that's going to work, because we'll see if it doesn't. Let's go ahead and make our task edit name. So I'm going to go back to my code. I'm going to copy our put, because it's going to happen very similarly to our put. And I'm going to say /task/edit name. We still need to find the to-do in the database using the ID that was passed up in the JSON body. We have our to-do completion time. And instead of changing the completion time, what we want to do is change the name. But I'm going to do a quick check in our to-do, and I'm going to make sure that name is still the same. Okay, it is. And I'm going to change our new date. We don't want to change it to the date. We want to change it to the name that was passed up in our front end right here. Okay. We want to wait for the database to save that and get that in there. And then again, we want to send back all of our to-dos. So I'm going to save. I'm going to save our front end. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to refresh. And I am going to edit task 2. And we get this lovely interface that is built into JavaScript that says, what would you like this task to be called? And I'm going to say new task name. And I'm going to hit OK. And it changed our task for us. Awesome. So we go back to our list. We go ahead and cross off the ability to edit a to-do. And we look at our list and we go, there is literally one thing left on our list, and it's deleting. All right, let's make our delete work. And then I promise I will pause for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and copy our onClick, and I'm going to change it. Instead of edit to do, it's going to be delete to do. We still need to pass in the ID. I'm going to copy all of this edit to do code. I'm going to not have my code format, even though I thought it was going to. Okay, I'm going to edit this. I'm going to call it delete to do. I'm going to change my endpoint URL because my method is going to be delete. The only information that we need to pass up is the ID. So I'm going to delete out my name window prompt. And all of this stuff is going to remain the same. I'm going to go back to my server. I am going to do a app.delete to my task. I'm going to async rec res. I am going to still send all of my tasks back with my res.send. I am even going to take my to-do and find by the primary key, but I'm going to do dot. I thought it was destroy, but Visual Studio Code is telling me it's delete. So let's see if this works. Going to await. I want the database to make sure it was able to delete it. And then I want to go ahead and send that back to the server, to the front end. So I'm going to refresh. And I get unexpected end of input on line 241. So I believe I missed a bracket. Okay, gonna refresh. There we go. So I am going to delete my new task theme. I'm gonna click on that, and it says delete to do is not defined. Okay, so let's see. It is called delete to do here. So let's go up here. And it is delete to do. So my guess is that my curly braces are screwed up. So edit to do. If you notice, my function delete to do is in my edit to do code. Well, that's not where we want it. We want that to be its own function. So now that I put the curly brace in the right spot, you notice my function edit to do is indented and is lining up perfectly with my function delete to do. Now we know that they're at the same level. They're at the right scope. So I'm going to save. I'm going to refresh. I have my code in here, and I'm going to hit delete. And nothing is going to happen. So we don't have any errors in our front end console, but it's important to pay attention to our back end console because what it says is unhandled promise rejection. This error originated in some asynchronous function. So what I believe is happening is it is not actually called delete like Visual Studio Code told me it was. I believe it is called destroy. Now we can go to this equalized documentation and go to model usage and do a search for destroy, and it's not here. So let's go to model definition and look at destroy, and it's not there either. So we are going to go to sequelize and do a search for delete by ID maybe. And what is going to come up is our destroy function. So let's see if this works. We're going to save. We're going to go to our front end. We're going to refresh. We're going to hit delete, and it's gone. And just to make sure it's gone, I'm going to refresh the page. It's definitely not there. I'm going to go to my wrong folder. I'm going to go to my SQL database. I'm going to refresh, and you notice it also is not there either. Okay, so we're making progress. There's one more thing that I want to do on this. Notice we created this users table, but we're not using it. And every time I create a task, I don't want to have to type in my name. I want to just be able to click on a drop down and have my name be an option there. So I'm going to take a quick minute to pause, ask for any questions. There are no questions. I'm going to go ahead and talk about how we're going to make this a drop down, a select, and then we're going to take a break. But I am going to pause just for a second and see if anyone has questions. The other cool thing that you guys can do, just so I know you guys aren't asleep behind your computer, you guys can open up localhost 8080, and in theory, you guys should be able to create a task on your computer, and because everything is linked in Visual Studio, I should be able to refresh the page and see the information in my database. And in order to do that, again, you're going to go over to Live Share in Visual Studio Code, and you should see my shared server. If you double click on that, it should open up, and I can see Caitlin just created something. And if someone else marks that as completed, I will be able to refresh the page and see the fact that someone actually completed that task. Note, I can't see who completed the task, but I can see that it was marked as completed. I'm going to refresh again, and super task was completed.
Max,
Cool.
when I did it on that one, my name popped up. That's why it's my first name and my last name.
So the reason it's doing that is because your browser is recognizing the fact that I called that field name.
Oh, I see.
And so the browser's trying to help you out and go, oh, would you like to autofill your name in for you? So that as much as I would love to take credit for that, that's actually your web browser that's filling in that information.
All right.
All right, so how are we feeling?
Max? Hello?
Yep.
Oh, I am at work. I am going to leave work, and since I'm coming from rural Canastota, it's gonna be choppy, or it
Sure.
may just cut my connection. But as soon as I get back home, I will return.
Sounds good. No problem. Safe travels.
Awesome. Thank you.
I can't hear you if you're talking.
Can you hear me?
I now can. Yeah.
Just a little slow today and doing the working on it. Give me a few if you would.
Sure. No problem. And if anyone else would like to share their screen with the code, if anyone is following along, that is also totally an option. Or if you want to, just continue, that's also fine.
Hey, Max, this is Dana. I'm working right now, just figuring out how to get connected to your server,
Okay.
local 8080 from within VS Code. So I'll be connected in a minute.
Okay, no problem. Thanks for the update. Okay, so I'm hoping to take a break right at 7 for 10, 15 minutes. So I'm going to continue on. I'm going to get the name
This right
field.
here.
Yep.
And then what do you want me to do here?
Create a task with your name.
Okay.
Just anything, just to test it out.
So I'm going to get that name field to be the dropdown. And we're going to talk a little bit about the primary key, foreign keys, and then we will take a break right after that.
Yep. And it should pop up in the list.
Okay. And my watch is yelling at me to stand, so it is definitely time for a break as soon as we're done with this task. All right. So what we're going to do is we want to make this a dropdown. So in order for it to be a dropdown, we're going to need some names in the database already. So what we could do is the proper UX answer would be to create a new button that says create user. Well, we should probably do that. Let's do it the right way. We're going to create a new button in the interface. We're going to go up to our table, and instead of just our submit, what we're going to do is we are going to do another div class equals call. And we are going to do a button in here that is going to trigger a on click of create new user. And we'll worry about what that's going to do in a second.
Hey, Max, I just want to interrupt really quickly.
Sure.
Just before you started, I was able to submit my task. So,
cool.
Just wanted to
so
make
if I refresh that, I can see it right here.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So we're going to create a new button, and the new button is going to say create user. I'm going to save, and I'm going to refresh, and we have our button right here, but it's quite hideous. So we are going to do a class on that called button, and we'll call that button. Let's see, I like pretty colors. What are our Bootstrap options? I'm going to do a quick detour to the Bootstrap documentation, and I'm going to look up buttons, and info looks pretty, so let's go ahead and do that one, button info. And while I'm looking at our interface, what's happening here is it's creating two columns for us, but you know what? That spacing looks a little weird. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say text-center on our create user as well. And now we notice they're kind of equally spaced. I don't really like the fact, though, that this is called submit, right? Submit normally isn't a great thing to add to your user interface because the person wants to know what they're submitting, what that button is actually going to do. So while as developers, we think is that as submit the data to the server, what we really want to do is say create task, right? Because create task is so much more descriptive than just submit. So thinking of UX, those little things are important. So I am going to do I'm going to rename my submit button create task. I'm going to save, I'm going to refresh, and now we have our create task here. Okay, so we want to make our create user work. So what we're going to do is if I click that, obviously nothing happens, and even my browser console yells at me and it says create new user is not defined. So I'm going to come down to where all my other code is. I'm going to actually copy our edit to do code. And we're going to say, instead of it's going to be user, and we're going to post because we want to create a new user. And what do we want to do? Well, we don't need to pass it an ID because we're not working on any user in particular. But when we prompt, we can still prompt for a name, but instead of saying, what would you like this task to be called? We're going to change it to what is your username? And we're going to say save. And now we need to go make this endpoint work. But before I forget, I need to change my function name. And I'm going to change that to create new user to make sure my on click from the code up above is going to call this code. And I'm going to comment out my update tasks in HTML. Because when the data comes back, we don't actually want to update the tasks. We only want to update the user list. We'll get to that in a second. So I'm going to go back to my server code, and I'm going to say app.post. Make sure I said post, yes, okay. And I'm going to do it to user, and I'm going to say async rec res. And before I forget, I'm going to res.send something. And while I'm in here, I want to go, okay, now I want to create a new user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say await user dot create. And what do I want to create? I want to create, I'm going to go look at my models, and my user has a name defined. Okay, so user dot create name, and what do we want name set to? Well, we want that set to the rec.body dot, and what are we sending up? We happen to be sending up name. So rec.body.name. Okay, and while we're here, we're going to follow the same model that we follow everywhere else in every other API endpoint that we meet. We're going to say, okay, when you create a new user, send back await users dot find all. So now the database is going to send back any users that we have. So I'm going to refresh. I'm going to say create user. It's going to say, what is my username? I'm going to say Max and hit OK. Now, nothing happened, of course, because this is still a text field. But if we look in our console, it didn't print anything out for us. So let's figure out why that is. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of our JavaScript console, and you notice there are no errors in here. So I want to know, hey, what happened? What went wrong? So I'm going to go to pSQL, and I'm going to go to my users table, and I'm going to refresh, and there's nothing in here as well. So now we're backtracking it, and we're going, well, hey, a new user didn't actually get created. So let's go back to our index.html, and user is here, and we're sending everything up. What went wrong? All right, well, let's go to our network tab. Our network tab says it failed. Okay, so let's look at that. Now, it did send up Max as the name, but user 8080, it looks like it failed trying to do that. And what the fail was is error connection refused. So what I think was happening is our server just so happened to be rebooting at the exact time I tried to create a new user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save my index.html code again. I'm going to save my index.js. I'm going to make sure that nothing's happening in my server, and indeed the server is running. I'm going to make sure my force is turned off because I do want to make sure that the data is saving in. Now I'm going to try it again. So I'm going to create new user. My username is Max. I'm going to hit OK. And now it's still pending. But if we look in our server, we have a SQLized database error. Invalid input syntax for timestamp with time zone. OK. That's a little weird, but we got a different error. We celebrate different errors. So let's go to our code. We are posting to user. So we're going to look at our post user. We await user.create name. And oddly enough, very oddly enough, if we look at what our query failed at, it actually failed at insert into to-dos, right? So looking at our terminal, our server terminal, we know something is up there because this is the only code that should be running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a search in our code, and app.post user is correct. Now I'm a little confused. Just do some spacing in our terminal, and I'm going to try that again. And what does it say? It says reference error, user is not defined. So you know what? I bet we had this issue as well up here, but I just didn't scroll up enough. And sure enough, reference error, user is not defined. Okay. Well, why is user not defined? Because user needs to come from our models. So now it goes, oh, you want the user model. Now I know what you're talking about. And the same goes here. Here, we need to say models.users.findAll. Now I just caught myself. Is it user or users? So I'm going to go look in my models, and it is user. So I'm going to change this to user. I'm going to refresh. I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to create a user. I'm going to say my username. I'm going to hit OK. And again, our task is pending. Something didn't work. So I'm going to look in my terminal. And now we do have our insert into users. And it is still having an unhandled promise rejection warning, invalid input syntax on timestamp. But it's still running on our to-dos, which is a little weird. So again, I'm going to do that same trick. I'm going to put some space in my terminal so I know what's happening. I'm going to create user. I'm going to say test. I'm going to hit OK. Insert into users, insert into to-dos. That's quite weird. I'm going to go back to my index, and I'm going to look here. Now look at what's happening. Our index is doing a call to user, and then it's also doing some stuff with task. So if we notice what our network tab is doing, it actually isn't failing with the user. It's actually failing trying to create a task. Okay, so we know something's funky there. Let's look at what's happening. So let's go back up to our button. Our button is create user, but because we have a button, what's happening is it's going, oh, you must be trying to submit the form. Well, no, we don't want it to submit the form to create a name and a task and a due date. What we want it to do is just create the user. So what we're going to do in our create new user is we're going to say, hey, an event's going to be passed in. And hey, browser, we're smarter than you. Don't do whatever you're trying to do, the default action. Just prevent that. Don't make that happen. So now when we save, we refresh, I'm gonna make some new space in my terminal and my server so we see what the new things are that's going on. I'm going to refresh, I'm going to create a user. The user is Max, and we notice the user came back with a 200 without any problems, and I now have no errors in my server. So I'm gonna go to pSQL, I'm gonna refresh my user table, and now we actually find out that that code was running and I've created 3 users. So that's all working. Now, if I go to my console, we also see that users came back as an array, and it has all 3 users there with the ID information as well. Okay, we're making progress. We have one more step that we need to do. We need to make that user data show up in a select. So in order to make that show up in a select, we're going to do a very similar process to how we make the data show up in the table. So instead of making my form up here an input class control form control name, I want to delete that out, and instead I'm going to make it a select. And just to test, I'm going to do an option with a user 1 and an option with user 2. And I'm going to refresh, and it's there, but my God, that looks ugly. Well, if only there was some CSS framework that we could use to make that pretty. So I'm going to do a search in Bootstrap for inputs, and I'm going to look for a select. And if we look, they have some select code for us. This is custom selects. I believe they have a select by default. And of course, it's not in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just try and do a class equals form control. And the reason I'm going to do that is because it worked on a regular input. Let's see if it worked on the select. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to refresh. And wow, doesn't that automatically look better? And we have our users in here. But of course, user 1 and user 2 are not what's actually in our database. What's in our database is me twice and a test as well. So let's get that showing up in there. So in our select, I'm going to do an ID, and our ID on the select is going to be user select. And then we already have some code running. So when the page first loads, go ahead and do a fetch to get all the task information. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste that down here. And instead of getting the tasks, I want to get the users. And so I'm going to go to my backend code. I'm going to app.get, and I'm going to get my user. And I'm going to async rec_res, and I'm going to res.send my users. And how do I get my users? I want to say, hey, wait for the database to return this information. Go to the database and find all my users. Okay, I'm going to save that. I'm going to go to my index, and down here, instead of updating my tasks in my HTML, I'm just going to console log out the data that came back from the server. I'm going to save, I'm going to refresh. I'm going to realize that my console is getting quite crowded here. So I'm going to look at this and I go, all right, you know what? I'm not using this debug information anymore. So I'm going to go to line 169, and I'm going to delete out my console log task because the browser told me, hey, that's where all of these logs are coming from. So I'm going to refresh. And I also see I have another thing here that's console logging out all my tasks. And that's on line 166. So I'm just going to comment that out as well. Never know when you need that. And now I'm back to just having my users. My users are logging out. And I have all of this lovely data that's accessible here. So how are we going to go ahead and get that to show up here? Would anyone like to take a stab at making that happen? We have the collaboration tool in Visual Studio Code. We might as well try and give it a shot.
Max, ask the question again, please.
Would you like make it so the data that is coming back from the server that we have access to right here, make it so instead of it just being in the console, our drop down is actually going to show the users that are in the database. It's okay for you guys to say no, and I will do it. Okay, I will go ahead and continue on that. Okay, so we're getting the data back from the server, and it's console logging out, and we see that we have access to the data. So we're going to do a very similar process to this update tasks in HTML, but because the only place that we are going to run this update select code is right in our fetch, there's no need to make it a separate function. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our let content to update equal an empty string again, and we are going to do another for loop, and we are going to say for const user of data.users, right? And it's called users because we can look in our array, our data coming back and see that it's an array. Okay, and what are we going to do? We are going to say content to update plus equals a new, we're going to use a template literal. We're going to say it equals a new option, and that option is going to be the user.name. I'm going to look in our data, and in fact, it is name. And we're going to close out the option. And once we have our string formed, we now need to go tell jQuery, hey, go get the select. And we called that select user select. And we want to set the HTML of that user select to the content to update. So we're going to refresh, and if we look, we have our dropdown with our users in it. And if someone else clicks create user and creates a user account for them, I can refresh this page, and I will be able to see that their user is in here. Now, what I can't do is what I can't do is if I hit create user and I do a thing called new user and I hit OK, we notice new user is not in the list. So what we need to do is update our select even when we create a new user. So I lied. We do need to use this code over again to update the select, not only when the page first loads, but also when we create a new account. So I'm going to abstract that code out, right? I'm going to do a new function that says update user dropdown. And some data is going to get passed in, and we're going to run through that data. We're going to do it all there. Now, in the fetch, when we get the users, when the page first loads, we are also going to update the user dropdown, and we're going to send in the data. But when else do we want to send that? What else do we want to update that user dropdown? We want to update that user dropdown when a new user is created. So instead of just console logging our data out, we are going to update our user dropdown. So we'll save that, we'll refresh, we'll realize that new user is in here. So we'll say new user 2 and hit OK. And when we pop open our select, we'll see that new user 2 is showing up there. So we have a couple more steps to do here. Someone just revealed a very interesting bug. Null is in there. Well, you know what? We probably don't want null to show up. So when we come back from break, we're going to make sure that when you hit create new user, you're required to type something in here. And if you don't type something in, we just don't want it to create that new user. The other behavior that we want to do is we want to say, okay, well, when I type in a new username, I want it to automatically select that in my dropdown. And then when you think we were actually close to finishing up, what's going to happen? I'm gonna click new user 2. I'm going to do a new task. I'm going to set my due date. All of this was working great. Of course, all of this still must continue to be working. I hit create task. And if I look at, I don't remember the task I just called that. If I look at the, say new user 2 task, and set my due date as tomorrow, I hit create task. My new user 2 task shows up, and my creator is now null. Oh crap, that select is not sending to the server the way we wanted to. So we're going to take a 15-minute break. I will be here in case you guys have any questions. I'm going to get started right at 7:30 again. Is that 15 minutes? Yeah, that's 15 minutes. So I will start again at 7:30. We still have some more work to do, but we're making progress. So I will hang around if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, I will see you guys at 7:30.
Max, I have a quick question. Where did the models.js folder come from?
Models.js is in the same folder that my index.js and index.html are in.
Right.
And so what we do is up at the top of our index.js, we
Right.
use a require to pull that file in.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Okay.
Thanks.
No problem. I lied. I'm going to grab a quick snack. You guys will see when I am back. I'm here if anyone has any questions. No, I said 7:30. I don't know if you guys want to get started 5 minutes early or if you would prefer to wait until 7:30. Okay. It is 7:30, so we are going to dive back in unless anyone has any objections. So, what we were doing before, I want to give some context on why we changed name from a text field to a drop down. So if I before, what we were doing was we were storing the username in the task field of the database, right? So if we look at our models, what we had initially designed was to store user ID. But instead of storing user ID, when we were trying to get this up and running, we said, you know what, don't worry about storing an ID, just store the name in there, store it in as a string. So if I go in here, and let's say we're making this to-do list for a software development team. And so the users are always going to be defined, right? There are only 5 people that use the software. They go into the dropdown, they pick their name, they're good to go. Well, what happens when that person gets married and changes their name? Or what happens when we look at the database and this database has thousands of tasks in it, and for every task, instead of just storing the created at time, the completion time, the due time, and the name, instead we store the name that they type in over and over and over again. Wouldn't it make more sense to just store a single number as opposed to the longer string that takes up space? So what we do is we use a table, right? And what we're going to do is do a join on that table. So we're going to say, hey, when you get the to-do information, also get the user information as well. And so what we're going to do is a couple things. One, we need to make sure that that's working in the front end. 2, we need to update our database models to use user ID instead of username. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out username, and I'm going to comment back in user ID. And I'm going to turn force back on the database, which is going to drop everything that we have in there out, which is okay, right? Because we're only in development. So I'm going to run force. I'm going to refresh this. We're going to see everything is out, even our users are empty. But if we go to our P-SQL and look at our users table, at our to-dos table, and refresh, we'll see that we're back to using user ID instead of using username. Okay, well, let's tell Sequelize, hey, those two are connected. So I'm going to turn off our sync force before I forget. And in here, I am going to, before I do the sync, I'm going to say, hey, this dot to do. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, the to-dos belong to a certain user. Okay, well, what users do they belong to? So we're going to say, hey, the to-dos belong to user. And Sequelize is going to say, okay, that's great. I'm glad I know that. But how do I know what the to-do belongs to in the user? What foreign key, what columns do we want to use? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, the foreign key in the to-do table is going to be user ID. That's how we're going to tie the two together. So we're going to say the foreign key is user ID, and the primary key, the thing that the user ID matches up to in the user table, is going to be just regular ID. Now, that may not seem important now, but we're going to see how we use that down the road in a second. Okay, so we're going to put that in there, and it's belongs to, not regular, belong to. And it says cannot read belongs to of undefined. And the reason why it's doing that is it's basically saying that this isn't in scope. So give me 1 second. I'm going to cheat and look at code I've already written for this. But I am going to stop screen sharing because the place I can go to get that information is company code, and I don't want to accidentally put that on YouTube. So give me 1 second. I'm going to get the answer to that, and then I will screen share it back. There is a way to do that properly, but I am blanking on it. Well, I was close to it being right. At least you guys have proof now that I do use Equalize at work and can go somewhere else to get the information. I would like to know is how I managed to do that. Well, that should be working. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen again, and we can try and debug it together, because that's what you would do in the real world. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to do desktop 1. Okay, and what it is saying is cannot read property. Let me put this out of the way here. Cannot read property belongs to of undefined, and that is on models 44. And so what we need to do is figure out why init. You know what I believe? Let's try and make this a regular function so we have access to a little bit more scope and see if that fixes it. Okay, that did fix it. So the issue was that because we used an arrow function here, the scope was a lot more defined. It was a lot more limited. So we didn't get access to the to-do and user that was defined right above it. So instead, when we make it a regular function, we now have access to to-do here. So perfect. That's exactly what we wanted to do. Oh, sorry about that. So let's continue on. So we're going to go here and we're going to create our user, and I'm going to say Max, and I am going to create my task, first task. And what's going to happen is when I hit create user, we need to look at what data the front end is sending up to the server. So what we're going to do is go to our create task. What did we call it? We called it new task. Okay, so our new task, instead of it just getting the value of name, we needed to get the value of our dropdown. So we're going to go up and look at our dropdown, and our dropdown is called user select. So if we go to our user select in our new task code, I'm going to comment out right now the call to the server. So basically, I want to say, hey, I just want to see what data you're going to send up before you send it up. So in our name val, I'm going to delete out the code to clear the name, because when I create a new task, I want it to keep that. It can go ahead and clear out the task and the due date. What I want it to do is keep the name value. So instead, I'm going to put in user select val, and then I'm going to console log out the name. I want to know what that's returning. So I'm going to set a due date here. Oh, first, I'm going to refresh. I'm going to do my task name. I'm going to pick a due date. I'm going to hit create user. I'm sorry, I'm going to hit create task, and it returns out Max. Well, that's great. That is what I set the name to. But the computer is like, I don't want to have to worry about the username Max. What if there are multiple users with the name Max? What I would much rather do is work with numbers. I would much rather work with the ID. So we go, okay, sure. If you want to work with IDs, if you're better at doing that, we're going to go to our code that updates the user dropdown. And instead of just passing in the username, we're going to add a value field to the option. And that value field is going to be the user.id. So we're going to save that. And now when we refresh and we say we create our task and we set our due date and we hit create task, you notice 1 comes out instead. And that's because we gave the value of the option the ID of the user. So if we create another user, we can look in P-SQL and look at the content of the users table and see Testy McTesterson shows up here. And so if we pick Testy McTesterson and go to create a task for him, we notice, oh, that did not work. Let's try that again. He does have an ID of 3, so I was hoping that 3 would come out in the console. So if I hit create task, 3 did come out in the console. So that means we now have access not only to the user's name, but also to the ID. And normally we display the value out to the user, but under the hood and in our JavaScript, we want to use IDs in particular. And the reason for that is because there may be 2 users with the name Testy McTesterson, but we know they will have unique user IDs. So what we're going to do is we are going to look at our task creation code. And what we want to do is instead of posting the username name, what we instead we're going to do is we are going to pass the user ID. And so we're going to update that up here. And then we are going to pass that in with our request.
Pay attention to line 124. Okay.
What's that?
No, you already did it, the line 123.
Okay. So now that we have updated it on the front end, let's go update it on the back end. So we're going to go to our index.js. We're going to look at our post for the task. And instead of passing in user name, we are going to pass in user ID. And we're going to make sure we update that because that's where it is in the body object as well. So I'm going to save, I'm going to refresh. I'm going to refresh again. The server hadn't finished rebooting yet. So I'm going to go to Testy McTesterson. I'm going to create a task for him called test1. I'll set a due date for tomorrow. I'll hit create task. And we see test1, so it created it for us, but the creator is undefined. Okay, well, that's not what we want. So let's go through our database trace again. So I'm going to go to P-SQL. I'm going to go to to-dos. I'm going to refresh. And we notice here that the user ID is set to 3. So the data actually has the data stored properly. Okay, so what's the problem? So let's look at the tasks. Well, the tasks coming back to the server have test1. They have created that. And if we expand this, we see that the user ID is also set to 3. Okay, so the data is coming back to the front end, right? But we don't want to say that the creator is ID 3 here. We want the data to come back and include the person's name who posted it, not just the ID. So we're going to go to our server, and in our get function, instead of doing a find all and just saying order, we're also going to say, hey, go include something. Well, what do we want to include? we want to include the model models.user. And so if we save that and refresh, we still have creator undefined here, but I'm going to go to our front end and change our code to get the task to also console log out the data, because that's what I want to see. I'm going to refresh it. Now we see our tasks like we would expect, and we see our ID, and we have completion time and name and all of that. But also notice we have this new thing called user, and user happens to contain Testy McTesterson. Well, that's great. That's what we want. Now we can go update our front end. But how does it know that? Because in the database, it just has a user ID of 3. Well, it knows that because in models, we told SQLize that to do belongs to the user. And so SQLize goes, oh, I get it. If I look at the foreign key, if I look at user ID 3, that means I can go to the users table, do a join on that data, and get all the information that is in the users table as well. I'm going to pause for a second there because that's a lot to sink in. And if we look at our query, what happened here is we say, oh, go select the to-do ID, the name, created that, all of that stuff. But then you also notice that we do a left outer join right here with users. And we say, okay, connect the to-do user ID to the users table ID. And because of that, we now get access to the fields in both of those tables. So that's pretty cool. But we want to use that data now, right? So we're going to go to our front end, and in our update tasks in HTML, we're going to update that to, instead of it just being task.user, we're going to say, hey, task.user. So go to the user data that came back from our model and pull their name out. So when I refresh, we now have our creator as Testy McTesterson. Okay, that's pretty cool. So we are going to run into one issue though, is when we create a new task, let's say Max, and we say Max created this, and go ahead and set our due date and hit create task, we get this new error in the console, cannot read property name of undefined. So if we look at the data that came back from that, what we're going to see is that the task data came back, but there's no user data in here. And so what's happening is our server is sending back the model user data only when we get the tasks. It's not sending back the model user data when we put a new task in. So when we save that, we also want to do that basically whenever we send back the to-do table, we also want to send back the user data with it. Now, there are a lot of ways that we could go ahead and optimize this API so we aren't sending so much data back and forth. But for the purposes of this example, I want you guys to see the flow and kind of see how we get things from the model and bring it back and stuff like that. Okay, so I believe I put that in everywhere. So I'm going to save, I'm going to refresh. And now I can see Max created this. And if I create a new task called test task, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to hit create task. And now I get that information in there. And if I mark as completed, that still works. If I delete the task, that still works. And I can edit this. I can say Max created the name on this. Again, I can hit OK. And that still updates. So let's go to our to-do list. we realized that we got delete working, so we're going to format that and do a strike through on that. And if you notice, everything on this list is now crossed off. Yay! We finished the to-do list. So we actually built a full stack app that's saving things to the database, is not only doing CRUD, but is doing CRUD on a relational table, right? So it's storing the information properly on the users table and in the to-do table, and then linking those together with a join. And so if I refresh this page, I can see that Linda just created a task, and I can also see that she marked it as complete. So we just made a cool little to-do list app, and it works pretty well. So the next steps that I would do from here is, one thing that is driving me crazy is that I called it task in the front end, and I called it task here, and I called it task on the button. But as soon as I hit the edit button, it's called task there. So you look at that on the surface and you think that's all great. And then you get into the backend code, and it's making an API call to task, and you're thinking, okay, I understand all of this. And then all of a sudden it's called to do. Okay, well, that is not good design, right? It should be called a task everywhere. So my next steps on this app would be to refactor this. So go in, add some comments, and then change the name of that table to task, and make sure that we don't call task to do anywhere, and make sure that it is consistent. I would also go in and start looking at things like, if I hit create task here and then refresh the page, we now have null Testy McTesterson. Well, that isn't great. So what I would do is go into the database models and do a verification and make sure that, hey, task should never be null. It should never be empty. And if it is, don't let it be created. And then I would also go into the front end, and when I went to create a new task, I would come in here and I would say, hey, before you clear the values, before you do anything, if there is not a task or there is not a due date, window.alert, please set data all, please set all data in the form. Else, go ahead and do all the things that we told you to do, clear out the data and send it up to the database. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to refresh. And now if I hit create task, it says, please set all the data in the form. And if I think I get clever, oh, well, that's a mistake. I wanted that to throw an error. So I'm going to refresh. Task 2. What did that do? Refresh. Task 1, 2, 3. Create task. Due data is not defined. It would help if I said due date instead of due data. Okay, now let's try that again. Test 1, create task. It still throws an error until I go in, I set a date, I hit create task, and now that data is going to show up in my table. Okay, let's continue on and do the validation. When I hit create user, if I hit cancel, all of a sudden I have null in my database. Well, I don't want that. So what I want to do is say create new user. Instead of doing my window prompt in here, I'm going to move it out to here. And I'm going to say const name equals window, what is your username? And then I'm going to surround this whole thing. And then if the name exists, if name is not null, and if name is not an empty string, that's what this shorthand is for. Now go ahead and save. Try and delete those nulls out of my database without having to write a new query. Oh, good. pSQL doesn't completely hate me. All right, I'm going to delete those out. Now, when I refresh, I have no nulls in my dropdown. I can create user. I can hit cancel. And when I click in here, I don't have nulls again. And I can even refresh the page and make sure null is not showing up. So there's definitely more we could do with this app. We could do some sorting. We could make it so you could click on the due date and see all the things that are coming up now, and you could click on due date again, and it would flip all of them and show the most, the furthest away due dates at the top. We could make it so maybe you want to mark as uncompleted, right? You want to reverse this. So maybe you would put a new button in here and make an API endpoint for that. Maybe you want to make it so you can change the creator. Wouldn't it be nice if I could hit edit and change not just the name of the task, but also the creator on the task? You could get fancy and do that. For now, I'm going to try and stop here because I want to make sure that you guys have time to ask questions and get this working on your side as well. So the homework for tomorrow is going to have everything that's working in the code right now also working on your own computer. When you have that working, go ahead and either send me a zip of your code on Slack or submit it through Google Classroom. I will create a new assignment for that. I know you guys all hate Google Classroom, but I do want to make sure that you guys are understanding this code. So the assignment is not only to get this code working, it's to go in and add comments and make sure you understand how this all connects together. And don't just use the comments that I'm going to put in my code. Actually go through and try and explain it on your own, because we now not only have 299 lines on our front end, but we have a full 110 lines on our back end, and then we have another 50-ish lines on our models. So we wrote a lot of code to get this working. So it's important to understand how it's all kind of wired together. So I would encourage you guys to try and replicate this now. I'm going to be here until at least 8:30. So if you have any questions, you can hop in Zoom or ask them in Slack, and I will go over it. The other reason I don't want to use the next 30 minutes is because starting tomorrow, we're going to start diving into sales. Because one thing you may ask yourself is, well, you know, we're writing a lot of code. We're writing a lot of code to get the user. We're writing a lot of code to create a new user. We're writing a lot of CRUD endpoints. Wouldn't it be great if there were some framework where I could just define the models and it would make all the endpoints for me magically? And hey, wouldn't it be great if we could add a sign-in screen to this? So instead of just being able to pick a user and post as anyone, I would love to be able to create a username and password and make it so only I can post as me. So that's benefits of sales, and there are a lot of others. Another thing you might say is, hey, I saw you scrolling up and down index.html all the time and scrolling up and down index.js all the time. Isn't it hard to find that code? Wouldn't it be easier if I could just go to a specific file? Wouldn't it be nice if our models were separate from our views, which were separate from our controller or our endpoints, our backend? And that's what we tried to emulate here in Express, but these files can get huge. So these are all benefits of using Sales.js. So starting tomorrow, we're going to start diving into MVC. We're going to start diving into sales. We're going to do this entire project again. However, we're going to do it all in sales, and we're going to see the benefit of sales. So the plan is tomorrow to dive into that and just give you guys a teaser so you can play with sales over the weekend if you would like. And then on Monday, we'll see where we left this app off. It did take us almost 3 full days to build out this app. I'm hoping that we can cut maybe a third of that time off and do that in sales, and then figure out where we want to go from there. Authentication is going to take a little while to get that up and running. But I think we made awesome progress. I'm really glad that we made this app work. And I think it's also great to see how full CRUD works, right? We did create, read, update, delete for all the tasks, and we properly modeled the database. So those are all important things. I will go through this code either tonight or tomorrow and write comments on all of it. But right now I will be here for the next 30-ish minutes. If you guys want to work on recreating this, I would highly advise you don't copy and paste anything. There is some value in some muscle memory of typing in the code yourself. It's the best way to learn syntax, to get the arrow functions working, to realize that scope is a thing, to realize that indentation is important. I would just recommend that you guys type this all out. Go ahead and send that to me either in Slack or in the Google Classroom. I will create that assignment now. And then I will open the floor up to questions for the next 30-ish minutes.
Hi, Max. I have a question. I put in a task, practice coding, but it showed up as your name. I think I forgot to hit create user after I put my name in it, but I am in the list now.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to create a task under your name that says, and hit create task, and it did show up with your name.
Right.
What I bet happened, and this is a great question, is I'm going to create a new user called Bob, and I'm going to hit OK. And look at what happened. Name went back to Max.
Right.
Well, name shouldn't go back to Max. Name should go to Bob. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at our so in our create new user code, we are going to actually go to the back end and look at user. And instead of just sending back all the user data, we're going to do a new thing that says const new user equals await models.users.create. And instead of just sending back all the users, we're also going to send back the new user in particular.
Okay.
So I'm going to save. I'm going to go to my front end code, create new user. Some data is going to come back. I'm going to console.log out my data when we update the user dropdown. Okay. And I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to create a new user called Bob2, and I'm going to hit OK. And we have our users data just like we did before, and we have everyone that's created, and we still need that to update the select. But now we have a new user. Now, Bob2 isn't important. We had access to Bob2 before. That's what they typed in. But what's interesting here is we now have ID. So we can use ID to set the dropdown to that new user ID. So what we're going to do is, instead of just doing the user select, we are going to say, if the data has something called new user, then grab the user select and set the value of that dropdown to the data.newuser.id. So I'm going to save, I'm going to refresh. My users are here. I'm going to create a new user called Bob3. I'm going to hit OK. And Bob3 now gets set to the name.
So unless we have a way of authenticating the user, we will just have repeats, because I've noticed now there's 2 EVAs in the database, right?
Yeah, so what you could do is write some validation. So I'm going to I'm going to open some code because I don't remember how to do this off the top of my head, but because I'm the teacher, I'm going to stall and say I totally do. Okay, so what we're going to do is in here, what if we want to say that, hey, names should be unique in the database. Two people aren't allowed to have the same name. So I'm going to make this an object. Delete that out for now. And I'm going to say, hey, the type of name is still a sequelize.string, but I want to validate that and I want to say if there is not a value in the name, throw new error. Oh, you know what? I don't know. I lied. This isn't how I want to do it. How I want to do it is I want to say name must be unique. And so when we do that, the server's going to boot up and we are going to go to our pSQL. We're going to refresh and we're going to delete out your duplicate just to make sure it's not going to cause problems. Okay, so we've done that. All the names are now unique. And so if I save and I try and create a new, wait for the server to reboot, refresh, create a new user, and I'm going to try and create a new user called Max, and I'm going to see if this works. I have a bad feeling it's not going to, but let's try it. So I'm going to try and create Max, and I now have 2 Maxes. So I'm going to look up how to do uniqueness in Sequelize. I thought it was just unique. Oh, what it needs to know is what are we making unique, right? Because no, that should have worked. And of course, now my dog is chewing on a bone vigorously because I can't figure out how to make this work. She always has the best timing. That is a good question. I'm going to open the floor up to other questions. And once I figure out how to make names required to be unique, I will get back to you. Okay, figured it out. So because we added, we updated the database, when we sync it, when the server reboots, whenever we change the structure or the attributes on the database models itself, we need to turn on force true. Now, that would obviously be an issue in production, But in production, we would be using migrations so that doesn't become an issue. However, what I did is I have unique true here, but then I also had to turn on force true, which is going to empty out my database, but now the database is set up so it knows that name has to be unique. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to refresh. I have my test user, and now when I create a new test user, I'm going to hit OK. I don't get a second test user, but if I look at my console and node, I have this sequelize unique constraint error validation error. Okay, well, that's great. I'm glad that sequelize is telling me that that's invalid. I'm not allowed to do that. But you know what? We should probably tell the end user, hey, something went wrong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my index.js code. And when we create a new user, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and create that new user. And if all goes well, it's going to send back the user's data and everything's going to be fine. If it doesn't work, I'm going to catch the error. So instead of Node getting cranky and going, oh, there's a validation error, I'm going to basically say, hey, if a validation error comes out, I'll catch it. You don't need to worry about it. And you don't need to worry about it because I'm going to send to the back to the front end error first name already exists, or I should just say name already exists. And then I'll say, please create another one. All right. And then I'm going to create user. I'll refresh. I'll create my user. I'll say test. I'll hit OK. And ignore that for now. Now nothing comes out of my node terminal. But that error didn't show up because the back end is now sending that error to the front end, but the front end doesn't know to display that. So we're going to go in here and we're going to say new user. And we're going to look at a new user code. And in here, instead of just updating the user dropdown, we're going to say if data.error, if an error happens, alert the user with the data error. Otherwise, go ahead and update the user dropdown. And make things cranky because my curly braces are no longer matching. Okay, I don't know what I did, but let's see if that works. So I have my test user, and if I create a new user and say test and hit OK, I get my error name already exists. I look in my dropdown, test is there. I look in my database, and test is the only one in there. It didn't create a second test for me. But if I create a new user and call it test2, everything still works. Did that answer your question, Ava? I will take your silence as a yes.
Oh. You didn't hear me?
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay. I just said yes. Thanks. Thanks.
Okay. I'm here for the next 15 minutes. I'm completely fine with silence, but I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have.
I guess my only thing is like I understood everything you did, and the last 2 days have been hugely helpful.
Mm-hmm.
It's so much. It's like, oh my God, I don't know if I could recreate that.
Yeah, so it's a lot, and it's a very common thing to start a new project and for your boss to come to you and be like, "Oh, I want a to-do list app," and you go, "Okay, yeah, that sounds reasonable. Let me go create that," and then you go, "Oh, well, what do you want it to do?" Because I just want to be able to create tasks, and you go, "Okay, well, do you want the ability to mark them as finished?" "Oh, yeah, I guess that's important." Okay, and are dates important? Oh yeah, I guess we should have a due date as well. Okay, well, do you need to be able to edit them? Well, yeah, you're asking silly questions now. Just make the app. And so when you start thinking about it, you start going, okay, I need to do pretty much CRUD on every table in the database. And every table in the database, I need to start thinking about, well, multiple people are using this. So I need a users table. And then you start going through and you start doing the ERD and you have your whole database designed out, right? Which at the end of the day is just 2 tables and user ID has 1 thing in it. And then you start looking at the business requirements and start going, all right, well, it needs to store the due date. It needs to store the person who created it. It needs to store the name. It needs to store whether it's been created or not. Great, now I have the whole database done. Then you start looking at it and you start go, oh my God, this is so much. And then you go, well, hold on, I can design an interface that does this. I need the ability to do CRUD on users, and I need the ability to do CRUD on tasks. So let me design something that's going to show all the tasks, the read part of CRUD. Okay, and how do I create a new task? Okay, well, I create a new task with a form. Let me throw that form in there. Okay, well, how do I delete a task? Well, I already have all the tasks showing, so I might as well reuse that, that to show the delete button. Okay, well, there's only a U left. Let me throw in an edit button. Great, now I'm done the whole front end. How do I make this front end work? Well, I need to make a CRUD endpoint or an endpoint for each letter of CRUD, create, read, update, delete. So I'm going to write all of those out. Okay, well, in order to create, read, update, or delete anything, I need my model set up. So I set up my models. Okay, now all my endpoints are created. My models are set up because I already finished the ERD. My front end is already done. Now all I need to do is wire the front end to the back end. Connect those together, and all of a sudden, wow, I have a full app done. However, at the beginning of this process, you go, I don't know where to start. And you start jumping around and you start trying to get it all working. And when you focus on what's the one thing I'm trying to do right now, right? And that's why we kept on going back to this to-do list, is because we're just accomplishing one bullet at a time. And when we get that bullet done, we celebrate the fact that it's done, and then we move on to the next one. And so almost every time I start a project, I go, there's so many things I need to get done here. And if you dive in and just start working on them, your project is doomed to fail. But as soon as you write out your list, and then I would even take this a step further and order this list, and then look at this list and go, you know what, it's a pretty big task. I want to break that down into subtasks. All of a sudden, every day you wake up, it doesn't matter if this project's going to take you an hour to do or a year to do, you know what you're working on and you're punching through the list. And because you're just making progress, it doesn't matter how big the project is, you can accomplish it because you already have the list of what to work on.
That makes sense.
And it sounds stupid, right? Like you look at that and you go, of course I would have a list. Like there's so much to do. But when you actually do it, all of a sudden it doesn't matter that this list is 40 pages long, because you're crossing things off and all of a sudden, before you know it, you're on page 40.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. I know you wanted the answer to be, oh, well, it's actually easier than that.
No, I just kind of have to be reminded of that sometimes.
Yeah, the good news is that this list, it doesn't matter what kind of app you're making. It doesn't matter if you're making a calculator or you're making the next inventory management system for Apple, or you are working with jet engines at NASA. At the end of the day, you need to create, read, update, and delete. And you need to do that in a database that's well formed, and you need to do that through a backend server, and you need to make some front end to make all of that work. Right? And so when you connect that to your capstone and you start going, okay, well, I need the ability for people to post requests for help. All right, well, I need to make my database because I have users and I have a table for requests. Okay, and I need to make a front end that has a form, and that form is going to have some fields in it, and that needs to do something when it submits, and then I need to connect my back end API endpoints to my front end using fetch. And I need to update my interface to show that the request went through. All of that sounds very similar to, oh, I need to create a new to-do. And anyone who's on the call can throw out their capstone, and I will draw the lines for what's happening in their capstone and what we're doing right now.
So Max, do you want us to, are you going to push this up to GitHub, or do you want us to basically go through the video and just recreate what you did?
I've already pushed it up to GitHub. I have, I've now gone ahead and pushed that up to GitHub. So it is up there. You're welcome to reference the code that's on GitHub, but I would encourage you to not copy and paste it at all.
Right. Okay.
Because then you're going to actually think about, I would also encourage you not to go through the file line by line. And instead go through it of, okay, well, in order to get this button to work, I need to go write the backend endpoint. So go to the server, write the backend endpoint, and then go to the front end and implement that endpoint, right? And the reason for that is instead of doing all your backend endpoints at once, which is a method that that full stack developers use, instead it will help you remember how this is all connected and how this is all wired together.
That makes sense.
The other benefit that you get is you can test it along the way. So if you go out and write all the backend endpoints, you don't know if half of them are working, if half of them are broken, if all of them work, you just don't know. So going through and trying to make the features work independently and then kind of writing the code as you need it, it will help you make sure it's all working.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. The kind of cool thing is I know you guys are connected to my server because I can see some SQL queries executing. I can see you guys creating new tasks and doing different things in the node terminal. So it's nice to know that you guys are working on it.
Yeah, I was just showing it to my son because I'm trying to encourage him to code. So far with no success.
One thing my parents are always disappointed in is I am a couple college credits away from actually getting my degree from Syracuse. And I got a job offer before I was able to finish up. And every time they push me on why I haven't finished my degree yet, I pull out my paycheck and I go, oh, let's compare this number to the number that you guys worked 30 years and finally retired at. Oh, right. And I know it is such a bad move to make. But whenever my parents go, why haven't you finished the degree? I'm like, well, because I don't need to finish the degree. There's so many opportunities out there for developers, and it pays so well. And on top of it paying so well, it's so easy to move up the pay scale that it doesn't take 30 years to reach the top level and be making a lot of money. You're able to go from entry level to junior to senior level developer in sometimes a 3 or 4 year span.
Look at Ryan. He didn't go to college at all, and he's really smart.
Not that I'm discouraging college.
No,
both my parents were teachers. And so when I finished high school, there was no, I did very well in high school and I took all the honors and AP classes and all of that. But there was no question of whether or not I was going to college. There was no exploration of other options. It was just assumed that I was going to college. And so the only thing that I regret was that was a question, right? Like, or that wasn't a question. Right. I probably would have ended up at a college even if that had been asked. But I wish at the time there were more boot camp options, that people knew that boot camps were available, that I would have loved to go to a boot camp and launch my career off of that. Instead, I went to the iSchool, thought I was learning all the things that I should be learning at a boot camp, and ended up self-teaching myself all the things that I am teaching you guys now.
Yeah, college doesn't do great at teaching you practical things like that.
Right.
It meant something different, though, to probably your parents' generation, like me.
True. Tons of education and nothing, like, it's so true. Practical. Huh? Yeah.
All right. Good night, Max.
All right. Have a good one. I will be here for 1 more minute if you guys have any last minute questions. Drew, every time I look at your profile picture, I think that's actually you and you're just frozen in place. I don't know what it is about your profile picture in particular, but it just looks like the video camera froze.
Yeah, it was a really good picture of me, to be honest.
All right, guys, it is 8:30. I'm going to call it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask on Slack. This code is up in GitHub now. I will go create the classroom on the assignment on Google Classroom, or if you'd rather just Slack it to me, that's also fine. Tomorrow we are diving into sales and MVC, and we get to create this app all over again. But I will leave it up to you guys if you would rather do the chat app instead of a to-do app. That's fine. If you guys get creative and have your own app that you would like to create that is very CRUD oriented, we can also give that a try. But I'm signing off for now. And if you have any questions, send them over in Slack. I will see you guys tomorrow.